So Don, so you've been with the FBI for quite a while before you joined PwC.
That's right, yeah.
And I can just imagine what the audience is thinking right now. So, you know, inquiring minds probably really want to know what happened to all those Hillary emails that she deleted? And what's on those things? You probably can't elaborate.
I have no idea who Hillary is. What are you referring to there?
In all seriousness, you know, we're here today to talk about security and risk management. And, you know, most CIOs that I talk to, they're a little bit nervous about the cloud. Everybody's got some level of a cloud strategy, and it really, you know, it's important. Makes their, you know, it'll make their companies relevant at the end of the day. Without that solution, without working towards those various things that we're seeing, you know, evolve within the industry, we're going to end up in a situation where, you know, old school IT might take over here if CIOs aren't adopting that. And as you can imagine, you know, the cloud brings a lot of scary things to the table for a CIO. So what advice would you give to CIOs and CISOs in our customer base, you know, so how they should embrace the cloud, how they should think about it, and really what advantages, you know, it might provide to them in their security structure?
Sure, it's a great first question, Ed, to lead off with, and I appreciate the question. I think it's really what brought you and I together. It's what really set up the situation where you and I ended up on stage talking with one another. I mean, there's different ways to lead in the IT world. There's different ways to employ security and talk about those things. But one of the things is, you know, relationships matter, and we're trying to lead by example by that. You know, you and I, a CIO, and as someone who works with CISOs all the time, and having been in those roles previously myself, you know, there is a big difference between us battling over budgets and strategy, or me trying to slow down what you're doing on the innovation side, or any of the folks in the security world doing that. And so the cloud question is one that presses on all of us. Whether we're going to virtualize or whether we're going to stay in an on-prem environment, I'll tell you what, for our point of view is, and the way that we're working with people right now is for CISOs and anybody working in security, cloud is a great enabler for security. It's going to help all types of things move more quickly. It's going to help a lot of strategy for the company, but it's going to help most companies get out of what's usually a pretty legacy network situation, and also technical deficit, particularly on the data storage side, and that's where we focus a lot of security focus and implementation. If the company's trying to manage those things themselves with gear that's outdated, if there's end-of-life issues, just the patching responsibilities alone, entering into a very responsible and robust relationship with cloud providers is a great way to move security programs ahead, while at the same time meeting a lot of business strategy elements. And so, you know, our perspective is that it only adds value. It certainly does add risk in certain areas whenever you're starting to get data into a more centralized location. That does make the attack surface change a little bit. However, it also, because of those reasons, from modernizing as well as using the compute in the cloud itself oftentimes, and the gateways and different accesses, we're vendor agnostic with what we do, but there's many more strategies to control access through identity, control access and understand who's taking what data when and where, and also to stop access in a very rapid fashion that quite frankly is impossible on most legacy networks. So it's a good strategy to move forward, but it has to be done in team with the CIO, with the overall strategy enterprise, with the business leadership, with the lines of business and products. And that's where you start to see security actually enabling business rather than chasing or slowing it down.
It's really different than old school security, you know, thinking was how much pain do I inflict on the enterprise, you know, is good enough, right?
Sure.
I think we certainly have to evolve beyond that today.
Right. Yeah, we really like to talk about that difference where, you know, a compliance-driven security program that's constantly pushing people and operations and behaviors in away from innovation, that's constantly putting a board of directors and a C-suite or executive leadership teams on notice about threats rather than solutions, is an old school approach. It's something that has given the particular slice of the industry that I'm in somewhat of a bad reputation, and it also has led to a lot of very tool-based strategies, things where we're just bolting things onto the network to try to impede traffic flows, to try to slow down or otherwise monitor access and different elements of the customer experience that really are not helpful. So yeah, we want to move past those paradigms rapidly. And fortunately, the thing about the cloud environment too is most of the engineering, the DevOps world, SecDevOps world, all those things have really enabled applications to move more quickly in the cloud with security alongside as an actual part of the engineering strategy. So as that cycle picks up, and it's increasing everywhere, most tools, most companies focus on security, focused on cloud and virtualized environments, at least from a hybrid or even edge environment. As all those things start to come together, the entire ecosystem and environment get much cleaner and more easy to manage.
So, you think about risk in this world that we're dealing with today. Our data is spread all over the place. Compute is everywhere. As we move forward, you look at clouds, hybrid clouds, on-prem applications, and infrastructure that's running. I mean, how should a CIO or how should the CISO think about that risk? How should they categorize the work that they're really going to, focus their budget around and their strategy around to really make sure that they're tackling the right surfaces first,
right,
and going after those things? Is there a methodology or an approach that you've used that you found that is helpful to people on that front, or that give people some guidance or pointers there as to where to start first?
Sure, it is. The perspective there is to really start focusing on data is what we're securing rather than on the networks themselves. And so by that, I mean, it goes back to the first part of the premise of your question, that data is scattered everywhere. And without organizing data, without understanding where it is, why we're storing it, how it's moving, what customers, either internal or external, need access to that data, it really becomes incoherent to try to secure a network around those things. So shifting your security strategy to a data-centric strategy also helps with cleaning up data for the entire enterprise. It helps with all the regulatory environment that's changing, okay? GDPR, CCPA, all these different things focus on the reverse of that question, how much privacy is wrapped around those data. So I really like where we can talk as a team with the CIO world, with the security world, with the data privacy officers, with the general counsels, with the product environment, and say, hey, look, how much data do we actually need in our environment? And let's organize that, let's categorize it, and let's control the access to it based on identity and some of the other things that make sense, so we know who's touching it when. And if we have questions, if we have audits, if we have concerns, if we have inquiry letters from any of the compliance agents, we can very quickly and efficiently. Right now, some companies are taking hundreds of hours, multiple across teams, just to determine whether they've had a data leakage under GDPR or how serious it was and those things. And we've all seen those fines. They're extremely complicated, and just to even understand and grade out what the impacts are under the EU structure there is devastating. So now is the time to use or to look at modernizing where data is stored, and cloud environments are the perfect way to do that. You want to be able to uplift, be able to get both your management of your data into a place where you understand where it is and how it's being accessed.
Well, this data gravity barrier that Chris talked about earlier today.
That's right.
The data is getting stranded, and the volume of the data that we're experiencing, it's just phenomenal. It's hard to even get your arms around it. So we know that we're going to end up in this world where the information is going to be much more decentralized as we go forward. That has to bring some unique challenges from a securities perspective. It certainly does from an IT viewpoint. Our infrastructure just has to be pervasive across the world in our company anymore because of that. And we're running a digital realty. We run a combination of some systems we must run on-prem, to run the data center systems and security systems, card reading systems, et cetera, that we have in place. But there's just as much of our information is in the cloud as well. And it presents a very, it's a difficult situation to keep up with that for a CIO and to balance how much risk you're going to take based on the budget that you're working with.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and it goes back a little bit to the previous answer, and I want to make sure I'm addressing your question. It sounded like maybe there were two, even a third part to that question. But when we talked about privacy of data, data governance, the issue alone of why you're storing the data, most of the teams, the companies that we work with have a global footprint, at least data, usually up to 4 different continents is how we break that up right now.
Yep.
Whether country is a little bit irrelevant when we're looking at architecture, except for data governance in each per country, but we take that as a secondary approach. And as we look at that, a lot of times we can really challenge the company as well. And again, why are you storing this much data? Why do you have it over a period of time? And of what usefulness is it to you for your operation? That is something that companies simply aren't asking themselves. Let me try to illustrate that a little bit further. A lot of times with companies are discussing a digital transformation project or migration to a cloud environment, they're taking right out of the box their assumptions about how much data they handle, how much they store currently, and they're simply doing calculations of what that would cost to be in the cloud. Mm-hmm. If you back that up a few steps and look at privacy regulations and you look at what the business usage for the data is, although it sounds a little bit basic, it's amazing how that is not being taken into account. As that's done, oftentimes we're able to find that there's huge efficiencies in storing less data, or at least archiving on a regular basis. And then we get into some of the things we'll talk about perhaps down the road a little bit is how do you restore the data and how do you plan for that in the modern threat environment? And we start talking about ransomware and other destructive data attacks. How much exposure do you actually want to data that can be locked down and removed from your customer's access? So what are the strategies around segmentation, about looking at how the world works and what global efforts there are around those data? Why not, around that data, why not shrink that down to what you actually need to operate, what's actually profitable for you as an organization, and why not hand that other data off that you can archive? Maybe you need it for other reasons, but you can store that much more cheaply now, and in the environments like Digital Realty provides, other groups like that. We really do a lot of that with different companies, and it's a great strategy. It opens things up immensely.
Good transition, to your other comment is, I think a lot of CISOs, a lot of CIOs, they spend a lot of time worrying about a breach, really worrying about how they're going to recover that data in that scenario. And it always puzzles me a little bit that they hadn't planned for that in advance. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is a concern. It's something that we certainly coach a lot in our world. We work with both executive and board levels about how to handle crisis operations. We build a lot of value into those discussions about, look, the only crises that exist are not cyber related, but it's a great topic to help exercise those kind of things. Mm-hmm. So you'll always hear cybersecurity experts like myself talking about exercising and preparing and planning for those type of things. But getting down 2 layers from that, a lot of times we don't see it exercised at the technical level or the operations level. What do people understand in engineering teams, in infrastructure teams? What does the CIO need to think about when a modern threat enters the system? Perhaps one that is encrypting data at a rapid rate, like we see with ransomware, encrypting data in a way that stops operations. What sort of discussions are taking place, and what sort of mitigations are done there? The beauty of going back to your very first question is some of the cloud strategies that exist. Once those things begin to trigger and happen, once we see those in an environment taking place, those environments can be decommissioned offline within hundredths of a second. Yep. And the data that is corrupted can essentially be flashed over and brought back up. No one even knows that there was an event that occurred. And a lot of times having the data organized, like we talked about, through proper governance, proper location, proper storage, those bedrock elements that don't occur in a lot of our legacy network environments, that can't occur, quite frankly, end-of-life issues alone, patching alone. Mm-hmm. Once those things are settled into place after implementing a successful cloud strategy, those worries go away, or they should go away, where you're comfortable that you could get hit with something like that. Respond in real time, recover regularly, simply. Keep your business online in a true business continuity strategy.
Well, and that's really part of the TCO at the end of the day, right?
That's interesting, yeah. So you brought up an acronym, TCO, total cost of ownership, and I'm not sure what happened to the IT world in the last 10 to 15 years, and I'll date myself a little bit. I've been around this for a while, but the concept of total cost of ownership has gone away quickly because I think largely the vendor-driven environment that we all face every day. Certainly, I'm a vendor, and so I'm part of the driver in these areas. So many different tools, so many different ways to handle things. People are pretty quickly forgetting about what is that total cost of ownership and why is that important for operations. Do I want to be your CISO and fight you for budget every day, or would I rather have a comprehensive chargeback model that includes security, privacy, as well as storage, as well as availability, as well as business continuity, disaster recovery, factored in per end user, factored in per level of data that you're storing. If you do that correctly and your total cost of ownership is understood, you and I are going to get along. We're going to have a similar strategy. Either one of us is going to take the lead in the right moment, and then business is going to work, rather than what we see a lot of times where there's a competitive side, or as soon as we leave the room, we all turn and talk bad about each other because we just put a roadblock. One of us put a roadblock in front of the other, or an obstacle that makes it very difficult to do our mission.
I'm not ever talking bad about you, Don, because I know you know people.
I surely know.
Right? I know you know people. It's interesting.
Right.
It's interesting you bring those points up, because I think people don't do that planning up front oftentimes. Right. And there's this concept that we talk about all the time in our shop. Keep the lights on, right. KTLO. And I think oftentimes in that KTLO discussion that CIOs have with the business people, they don't really factor everything in that they should. Sure. Security is a key component of that is absolutely critical and essential to running the operations, making sure that the strategy is sound for the business community. And to your point, it's a small incremental cost at the end of the day to do this right. Right. We're not talking about billions of dollars here that need to be spent across an enterprise. It's when you look at it at the individual level, it's pennies on the dollar.
That's correct. That's where I think when you and I started talking a couple months ago, the fact that you guys use a very risk-based approach to your spend makes so much sense for the security side, as well as the entire operations of really any enterprise. But when we say risk-based approach, simply having priorities set around the data that's the most valuable, making sure that those controls around that data are employed in a way that's priced right for the value of that data. Not all data is the same, but this goes back to 3 levels back for the conversation we're having. Do you know where your data is? Do you know what types you have? What have you done in the last 20 years to organize your data? How much are you storing and why? When you do those things, you can actually then grade that data out in different values to make sure the security spend matches what you're comfortable with, what our world is comfortable with, what we can brief the board about in a competent way, and by the way, walk in with real metrics that matter. Key risk indicators, yes, we understand those for this environment. We understand where our data is. We understand how privacy plays with security. Some of the privacy fines, notwithstanding, boards have to understand that. But then also, what are our KPIs together? What are the joint KPIs? And that's really what I want you to think about if there's anything you take away today, how are you measuring your own performance in both IT production environment as well as IT security environment? And what are those performance indicators? How do you measure that? How do you report that cognizantly at whatever level you are? How do you report it for budgeting purposes? How do you report it strategically? Because if those KPIs are built properly, they're going to tell you whether you're performing in that environment for that risk, for that type of data. And you're going to be able to sleep. Teams are going to be able to function.
Yeah, sleep's a good thing.
Sleep is a good thing.
Most CIOs don't get a lot of that.
They don't get a lot of it,
right? I'm sure CISOs get less, is my guess.
If things aren't managed properly, that's the case. And that's everything we're trying to talk about here is just get things organized. And organizational principles, back to the cloud environment again, it has been a game changer for that. But if your enterprise is looking at doing that, make sure you're talking about it from a security point of view as well. We can really drive that discussion in a way that makes sense for all the budgeting, for the total cost of ownership again, and instead of just talking about data storage, compute, and keeping the lights on. Because it's great to talk about that, but then there's all these other expenses that weren't accounted for.
Exactly. So Don, the other thing that I know is on people's minds is, a lot of our customers still have their own data centers, or they're in the process of transitioning in. To a colo environment, or with cabinets or cages or whatever it is, and they're ending up with these hybrid structures that they're thinking about as they go forward. And they're managing physical security oftentimes around their own facilities. Right. And I think about physical security is just not enough anymore. It used to be in the old days, as long as I had a good lock on the door to the data center, I felt good because my network was contained within my own company. I had a private network that people couldn't access, et cetera. But that landscape's really changed dramatically in the last few years. And now as we look forward, this convergence of virtual or cybersecurity and physical security, it seems like an area that CISOs and CIOs, they really need to think about this in a different way. In our own company, we have card reading systems, to access the data centers or a particular customer area within the data center. And, we have portals that grant customers access so they can grant access to others on their side. But we try to take a very holistic look at that and understanding of that as we manage the risk around that, because it's not enough to just put a lock on the door anymore. We've got systems that actually grant access to allow someone to put a lock on that, to open that lock on that door or give that access to others. And so in our company, we see that as a very tightly converged model.
Right.
What do you see in the industry with customers?
Yeah, I wish we saw that point of view in other areas, because oftentimes what you're talking about, there's the physical security and then the information security models are two totally different teams.
Yep.
They're teams who have never really talked, oftentimes culturally don't really exchange ideas very well. The very nature of the people running each one of those organizations is honestly very different. So what does that mean in terms of where essentially now we have operational technology or IoT a lot of times driving what's going on in that physical security world? And I think that's a great question here, because we want those networks, and they really are networks, to be as organized as the larger network storage in whatever system they're protecting. And so what do I mean by that? Are they properly segmented, or have they now created a threat vector by installing digital access controls right into the main backbone of their data? Unfortunately, oftentimes they have. And that's simply because of a lack of understanding of how these different elements work, how these card readers work, how they're sold by vendors. Oftentimes is the cheapest and most efficient way to install them is on other network gear to make that work within the facility itself. So you want to slow down and make sure before your physical security teams are implementing those type of things that, first of all, there's a strategic look at it, but also that you're using that data to control access in a logical way. So what do I mean by that? Same thing we want to do with data. If someone doesn't have a role or a proper entry element, then they shouldn't be able to have access to it. But the most easy way to set up a digital card reader is to default mode. If you have that card, you can come in. Segmenting those physical spaces is just as important as it is in the IT world. It really is.
Definitely. So you mentioned IoT. It brings a lot of hype in the industry, a lot of usage as well that we're starting to see. Same with artificial intelligence, machine learning.
Sure.
How do you see that evolving in the security landscape? I just think back, 5 years ago when I drove my car across the Golden Gate Bridge, I either had to stop and pay somebody, or I had a special tag I had to have in my car. Now when I drive across the Golden Gate Bridge, it reads my license plate, it sends me a bill at the end of the month. And so how do you see that evolving in the security space?
Yeah, what we see, I think we have to just take a minute. In the security space, when we see a heavy IoT presence, if there's something going on in that manufacturing environment or something inside their customer network globally generally, where they've now deployed many, or they allow for networking of many IoT devices. What we ask them pretty quickly to do is let's do some team workshops with some whiteboarding exercises. Why are these IoT devices on the network in a way that can touch data that they don't need to? And it's really a line of sight issue. We also work from the reverse side, from the SOC SIM monitoring elements. If they can't see and understand IoT devices coming in, then they can't secure them. And so those two basic principles, we work from both sides of the equation. And once you start to set up policies in a way, and software-defined networking, software-defined perimeter tools advance so rapidly, they can absolutely keep up and allow for proper networking, proper access. Quite honestly, if they're doing this in cloud-enabled environment, it's much easier to control on the fly. All right, the compute elements, the software policy can be changed as rapidly as these devices are added. If not, then simply those devices are now vectors for threat into the environment. And if that's done thousands of times or tens of thousands of times globally, we've seen these very, very soon. They're very easily made into bot attacks and others. Sometimes direct line of sight right into major data centers. So it has to be taken into account. We do see the industry, talking about the security industry now, has done better with that. However, the manufacturers of these devices, they're not going to be responsible for the security. that's fine. There's no compelling reason or regulatory environment that would make them that. However, how we operate our data and how we control our data is really, it's always going to be up to us in yours and I's role.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, kind of last question. I know we're coming close to time here. And I'll draw on your past background in the FBI. If a company has a breach or they're concerned that they might, be in a scenario where they need help, I think there's certainly an opportunity for people to call on a lot of different government agencies. Can you share some thoughts with people on what's the best way to go about that? Do you start with local law enforcement? Do I call the CIA right away? How do if I think that there's something going on in my environment, what's the best way for me to engage?
Right.
And should I wait until the problem happens, or should I establish a relationship with those people up front?
Yeah, it's a great question. We wish most folks would have a relationship up front. Our nation's done pretty well through different ISACs and groups in all communities, InfraGard, different elements like this, where you can actually meet with state and local and federal law enforcement officials ahead of time about security incidents and have that relationship. More important than that is just understanding and having a game plan ahead of time. When you do that, that should always be based around the type of business that you're in the data. I mean, this answer is vastly different for those in aerospace and defense world, for the type of weapon systems that they're manufacturing and have digital access to, than it is for the banking community, who also has extremely sensitive national level infrastructure, data, and access. Different conversation as to when. Both of those groups are huge, either connected with federal law enforcement or different banking regulatory enforcement groups. Then it gets into groups that aren't as heavily regulated. Now, is there still a compelling reason to work with law enforcement? We would, from my previous life and in our current perspective is that there is, but do that in a properly planned type of way. Your in-house counsel is always going to have a perspective about that. So incident response is ongoing. You want to be able to manage those things. I can tell you from a past law enforcement background and handling hundreds and hundreds of breaches a year, where we would send teams out and respond to different groups like that. Law enforcement is not interested in data content or exposing to the media that you're suffering from a breach. Many times throughout every week and every month of the year, they're working confidentially with companies that do that, and you can absolutely trust and ensure that you're getting good advice along the way. So I think some of those past fears about media exposure and things like that have been proven not to be really realistic. The company's going to control that when you disclose a breach, if you've actually had one. The last thing about involving law enforcement, especially at the right level at the right time, it does give a sense of comfort for when you do brief out your board of directors, or if there is a rigor in compliance structures that you're operating to, you can actually report as a public company what measures you took, and you want to be able to have that level of expertise explaining what happened and have a final report that you can point to. Yep. It can be very helpful.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Don, for
thank you, Ed.
spending the time with us. I really appreciate it. Great conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks
I look
for having
forward
me.
to our continued conversations, because
Absolutely.
I feel like we've got a real connection going on between the two of us, and hopefully we'll set an example for the rest of the community.
I'd like that. Thanks, Ed.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
I have no sense.